The story of Noah's Ark is one that we grow up hearing in Sunday school and vacation Bible school. At a very early age, even in the crib, we learn that Noah's Ark is this giant floating zoo. I mean, like the best zoo in the history of the world, with giraffes and elephants, and a nice man named Noah to take care of them. Noah's Ark is a Sunday school classic with a boat and animals and a rainbow in the sky. And for most of us, it enters into our lives pretty much the same as Winnie the Pooh or Mother Goose. But then what happens when we get older? We learn a whole different story, don't we? A story where God decides to blot out creation by drowning everything in it except for one family and one pair of animals. And suddenly the story of Noah grows these sharp teeth and it morphs into a warning about what happens when we don't obey God. That seems like a rather bizarre approach to biblical literacy, if you ask me. I mean, there's the version we tell our kids, and then there's the version in the Bible. Now, obviously, the version of the Bible is not suitable for children, so we've come up with this fairy tale version for our kids, which, with the coming of age, gets smashed all to pieces with the truth. Personally, I find that to be a really weird approach. But what's even weirder is how our children's version has captivated audiences for generations, while the biblical version has ended up being more or less swept under the rug. Noah's Ark has become a brand, just like Disney. If you do a search, a Google search on it, you're going to find Noah's Ark toys, books, games, piggy banks, stickers, paint-by-number sets, balloons, bedroom sets, cross-stitch, cake toppers, clocks, and a whole lot more. And like Disney, there's even a theme park, which some of you visited recently. Noah's Ark has turned into this massive fable with a cuteness overload with animals all crowded into a boat, 2 by 2, side by side, so that no animal ends up lonely. Noah's Ark is popular. It's a commodity. It's a booming business. But what most people don't seem to realize is that this story is not about Noah's Ark, nor is it about Noah, or the animals, or even humanity's corruption and God's wrathful judgment. What it is a story about God. God, who created the heavens and the earth. God, who formed Adam out of the dust of the earth and breathed life into him. God, who ushered Adam and Eve out of the garden when they acted with disobedience. God, who made them clothes to hide their nakedness. God, who saw Cain kill Abel and watched as humankind set their hearts towards evil. God, whose heart was broken over and over again by her own beautiful children. Yes, her own beautiful children. I can say that because I know this story. I know this story deep inside my heart the way that only a mother can. When my children were young, there were many times when they would do the exact thing that I told them not to do. And then they would lie about it. Sometimes they'd get into huge fights and pound on each other until one of them or both of them were crying. Other times they would look me right in the eye and say something deliberately mean. These two beautiful and innocent creatures that I'd worked so hard to bring into the world would look me right in the eye and say something deliberately mean just to hurt me. And in those painful moments, there were times I would think to myself, I did not sign up for this. I want my money back. Then, of course, later I would regret having had that awful thought, and I would feel horrible, and I would vow to myself never to think that way again. Genesis 6:6 says, "And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. And as horrible as it sounds, there have been times when I have felt that exact same way. Obviously, I didn't carry it out, but as a parent, I do know the frustration. I know the hurt and the pain that leads to that feeling, and I'll bet that a lot of you know that feeling too. So to me, it's just as clear as day that this is a story about God, who at one time became so grieved in the heart that he was sorry for having made humankind in the first place. And I didn't even have to read any biblical commentary to figure that out. But let's back up a bit, because we do need biblical commentary. In fact, we need all kinds of scholarship, because there is still the matter of a flood that wipes out every living thing except for the inhabitants of the ark. And right away, that brings up all sorts of questions. Starting with the obvious, was there really a great flood that covered the entire world? There is no scientific evidence for a flood covering the entire earth, but there were floods, and there were other accounts of a great flood. We don't know very much about the flooding that inspired any of these ancient stories. We don't know if a lot of people were wiped out or if it just seemed that way. What we do know is that these disastrous events deeply affected how people perceive the relationship between God and the world, or gods and the world, and God or gods took a pretty big hit on this one. In the Hebrew story, God becomes disturbed by the wickedness of humans and decides to blot out from the earth not just human beings, but the animals and the creeping things and the birds. God even drowned innocent children and unborn infants, all because humans were wicked, and that's pretty intense. There was one man, though, named Noah, who earned God's favor because of his blameless behavior. So God instructed Noah to build an ark using some pretty specific measurements so that he, his family, and one pair of every kind of animal species could be saved, and life could start over once the water had receded. Noah followed God's orders, and once the ark was completed, everyone climbed on board and was safe from drowning. After a year, the ark landed on a mountain, and Noah released a dove and a raven to search for dry land, and once he was off the boat, he offered a sacrifice to God, who found the odor pleasing enough that God was moved to vow never again. There are a million ways to disprove a literal understanding of this story. So that means it's a myth intended to explain something regarding the human relationship with God. What is the relationship between God and humanity? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Sumerian legend that came along at least 1,000 years before Genesis, a man named Utnapishtim receives directions and exact proportions for the construction of a large vehicle to escape an impending flood. He takes his family and animals aboard to ensure that life on Earth will not be completely destroyed. He too lands on a mountain and releases a dove and a raven to search for dry land, and he offers a sacrifice to the gods who find the odor pleasing. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? So it makes you wonder, did the authors of Genesis pattern their flood story after the flood legend in the Epic of Gilgamesh? Who knows, because that's not all. There are other similar flood accounts from other parts of the world, and each story has its own spin. For instance, Genesis says it was humankind's wickedness that caused God to send the flood, but in the Babylonian version, it was more about population control and noise reduction. In the Greek version, there was a reference to giants in the section immediately preceding the God's decision to destroy mankind. And in the Babylonian version, Utnapishtim obtains immortality for his sacrifice But in the Genesis and the Greek versions, the flood survivor does not obtain immortality. What is the relationship between God and humanity? Early humans experienced floods, and I'm sure that it was devastating. Just like it was devastating in Houston or New Orleans or Miami or even Madison. And when things are devastating, we start wondering what we could have done differently or how did we manage to bring this on. The ancients experienced floods, and they told stories to explain the floods that all wound up pointing to God or gods as being the cause of the flood, because that's all they had. They didn't have the Weather Channel or meteorologists or Doppler radar. They had to come up with their own explanation because our brains demand some sort of a story to make sense of things. And God is where we direct everything that we just can't figure out what else to do with. So it doesn't make sense that 2,000 years later we should still be clinging to an ancient explanation for something that we can now explain through science or history or archaeology or anthropology. We're just plain old common sense. Because even my common sense is smart enough to know that any flooding that may have happened was not the result of a petty God looking to wipe out a corrupt humanity after only 5 chapters of life. In this time and place, we basically have 2 ways of reading the Bible. One way teaches that the Bible's words were divinely revealed to the authors, and that the words are infallible and inerrant, and that they should be taken literally and without question. The other way teaches that the words came from the authors themselves as they attempted to make sense out of the world and its relationship to God, and that they should be understood metaphorically and questioned freely. There are a lot of debates and disagreements surrounding the questions of source and factuality, and so far no one can prove a thing. But there is one thing that nobody can argue with, and that is that the words of the Bible were recorded by human authors. Biblical scholarship attempts to build a profile of who these authors were using certain tools like linguistics and emphasis and references to things that can help date when the piece was written. And what they have come up with is 4 main sources for the Torah, which are known as J, P, D, and E sources. So basically there are 4 categories which potentially could include many different voices from one particular era, or maybe just one voice. And in the 4 chapters of the flood story, 2 of these sources have been identified, the J source and the P source, which are 2 voices from 2 different eras. So the bottom line of all that I'm trying to get to is that the story of the flood is basically scraps and pieces told by 2 different generations and then put together by a 3rd generation, which means that we simply just cannot take this story literally. After examining the scientific evidence, it's quite obvious that the Genesis account of a flood was not a historical occurrence. The Genesis account of the flood was written by 2 Israelites known only today as J and P, who were trying to tell a story that would help their fellow Jews better understand their place in the world. Maybe there was a flood, maybe not. But there definitely was not a flood sent by a vengeful God who decided he had made a mistake and that the only way to fix it was to kill everyone and start over. I know that because the text portrays a God who at one time became so grieved in the heart that he was sorry for having made humankind in the first place. Like I said before, I know that grief. And the only way to find yourself in the middle of grief like that is when you love a child so much that they have all the power in the world to hurt you, and they use it. a creator who has been so deeply wounded by its creation that maybe that was what the writers could see. Maybe they could see that creation itself was groaning under the weight of sin and selfishness and hatred and greed. And they were warning people, come on guys, we need to back off here. We'll never know the answer, not in our time, but we have inherited the question, the same question that we have been asking since day one. What is the relationship between God and humanity? Because really, that is the only real question that there is. May it be with you all according to God's word. Amen. So now let us turn to page